Hello and welcome to this video. My name's Beckham. It's May 2019 and Photoshop and Lightroom has just released a new update. Most of the update is bug fixes and also new cameras added to Adobe Camera Raw and also Lightroom. But we also see a brand new slider called the texture slider. Probably one of the better ways to get to grips with this new tool is simply to open up one or two images and give it a try. That's what I intend to do in this video. The new texture slider is going to be exactly the same in both Adobe Camera Raw, Photoshop and also Lightroom. As you can see here, the texture slider is grouped with the clarity and the dehaze in the basic tab. This texture slider isn't a special effect. It's not like the one we see in the main window of Photoshop, such as burlap, for example. This one enhances or suppresses texture that's already there in our photo. Now, I've only had access to this texture slider for a couple of hours, but already I like very much what it does. Let's take a look at this image. As you can see by all of the sliders over on the right hand side, this is a basic untouched RAW file opened in Adobe Camera Raw. If we look up at the top right at the histogram, you can see I've got a fairly good spread of tones here. If I needed to do anything, I suppose we could argue maybe a little bit of white, so you can see a little gap on the extreme right hand side, but very little else needs to be done to this particular image. Now, in normal circumstances I may be looking at adjusting the clarity a little bit, and that helps, but what I'd like to do next is to put the texture from its default position to the extreme right. Now, if you keep your eyes on more or less the center of the screen and look mostly at the rivets and texture of the aircraft behind the lettering. So here we go. I'm going to step it up. Look at the difference. Now I'm going to double click that slider and send it back to the default setting. Keep your eye just to the left of that circle, that yellow circle, and you'll see the texture change as I double click. And now the fuselage looks a wee bit soft in comparison. Let me do that once more. Double click to bring it right back. And then I'll take it off, and what we'll do is go onto the image, right click. Let me just bring it up in size to 50%. Maybe that will help. I'll move it down just a little bit so we can see a bit of color, a bit of dark brown, a bit of light brown, and we'll do the same one more time. Double click, and I hope you'll agree the result is pretty impressive. Now, we do have to make sure that when we push this slider up to its maximum that we don't introduce any noise, but if you look up at the options at the top right here, you can see this image was shot at 100 ISO, and at this size I can't see any major changes to the background, but perhaps we need to look a little more carefully. But let's change the image and look at another example. Now, the image I've just opened up, I think this does need one or two tweaks before we apply any texture to it. Look up at the top right at the histogram. I do have a video on the use of the histogram, which is quite important. I can see from the histogram that perhaps I need to give it just a little exposure, just to bring the peaks a little to the right. I've got a good spread of tones to the left and the right, so I don't think I need very much else. I could choose from a personal point of view, maybe a little bit of blacks. I would probably push the color a little bit, and I generally add clarity to my images, so I would probably be doing that too. Now, because the clarity and the texture slider work slightly differently, we can use both together. But as I said, let's keep an eye on that noise. But now, if we look at maybe the top part of this image, as I go to my texture slider and step it up, there you can see a considerable difference. Let me take that off again. And it may help if I right click and come up just a little bit. So we can see a lot of that detail in the timber there. So once again, texture up to its maximum, and that looks pretty good. But of course, with an image like this, we don't have any smooth tones with which to see any noise if we're including some. Let me fit this back into the view, and we'll just take the setting off once more. I think you'll agree that it's going to be a tool we're going to use quite a bit. But of course, what we can always do is use the tool in a strategic way. Let me demonstrate that. As you can see by the spinning round of the screen, I've opened up a completely different image into the main window of Photoshop. This particular image was originally a RAW file, but it's now a JPEG. So maybe we can kill two birds with one stone here. We can demonstrate how the texture slider can be used in a strategic way, but also on a JPEG image. Because we can use Adobe Camera Raw with JPEGs by going to the Camera Raw filter. So I'm going to do that by going to my filters menu. I'm going to choose Camera Raw filter. We'll open this guy up into Camera Raw, and I'm going to right click with the zoom and choose, let's say 50%. I think that's going to be pretty good. So with a male portrait like this, we could give a lot more impact and texture to the man's beard and some of the wrinkles around his face. We can make him look perhaps a little more dynamic. But rather than apply it to the entire image, let's just apply it to the areas we want. If I go up and select the adjustment brush, we know we can work with a brush, but when we look down at the sliders, there's our texture. So for the sake of this demonstration, I'm going to push the texture up to the extreme right. I've got a bit of exposure here, so I'll take that off. I'm also going to leave my flow up quite high, so you can very easily see the effect I'm going to put in place here. I could make my brush slightly bigger or smaller, and I'm sure we'd need to do that in certain circumstances. But now let me just paint over the guy's moustache and his beard down here, and you can see the difference it's making, particularly in the whiskers on his face. Let's go up to his eyes and the creases in his skin, and you can see the change as I'm moving my brush over these areas. But I do emphasize the fact, let me go over the hair too, I do emphasize the fact that I'm using my brush here with quite a high flow, 50 if you look down at the bottom right, and of course I have chosen to put the maximum amount of texture because we're making a demonstration. What we do have here is some even tone background over on the right hand side. So if we wanted to see just how much noise is being put into the image, what we can do is perhaps first enlarge it just a little more. So if I go back to my zoom tool here and I right click and go to 100%, I'll move my image to the left a little bit. Reselecting the brush, it's going to remember all of those settings. You can see the texture is still set to its maximum, and my flow rate for the brush down at the bottom is still set to 50. So if I start to brush over on the background, now you can see just how much noise I'm bringing into that background, but then that emphasizes the importance of strategic changes on our image. Because when we make the changes on the guy's face, we don't notice the extra noise that we're introducing because we've got lots of texture there. But when we start to do the same thing on a background, then it's a different matter. Let me hit Ctrl+0, and what we'll do here is just remove both of those pins for a moment. Let me just reselect them. I'll delete the first one, click the second one, and delete that too. Because what I could do here is just take the texture on and off with the entire image. So there you can see the entire image. Keep a look on the guy's face around this particular area as I step this up. Difficult to see, I think, with this size image. Maybe I do need to just increase the size a little bit, maybe 50%. Let's step that slider up once more. Now we can see there's a phenomenal difference, but of course we are getting that in the background too. So strategic editing is always a great idea. Let me take that off of there, because if I go to my graduated filter, not that we'd need a graduated filter here, but when we select the graduated filter, there we have a texture filter too, or a texture slider, call it what you will. Now, as you can see by the quick change of the image, I've removed the graduated filter and I've applied a radial filter, just to point out that we have the texture slider available here too. Now, if we can use the texture filter to enhance the texture that's already on the photo, then perhaps we can do the reverse of that and reduce texture when it's right to do so. Here I have a female portrait. She's a young lady who doesn't need a great deal of softening, but let's take a look anyway by right clicking and just bringing the size of the image up just a little bit. Let's just drop the young lady down. Going over to the texture slider, if I move to the right, of course, it's not very flattering at all. Let me double click to reset it. But if I take it down only halfway down to what I could do, look at that. That's quite a nice looking effect. And of course, like the male portrait a few moments ago, we could always add this texture as a strategic change, not over the whole image. But in actual fact, if I hit Control 0 here to fit the young lady back on screen, it looks quite nice. Let me double click the texture, see if we can see the effect at this size. We clearly can, and if I take it to its maximum, well, there you can see the effect. Let me right click and come up a little bit, and there you can see the softness we've applied. Pretty useful slider that's going to be, I think. Here's another example opened in Camera Raw. This is a set of glasses that I shot a couple of years ago. I do have a complete set of videos on how this was done, because the background you can see there and the entire lighting for the glass was a flat screen monitor, much like the one I'm using now and what I'm recording this video on. That may be worth a look. Look over on the right hand side and we can see that the adjustments made for this particular image are not great. A little bit of exposure, a little bit of whites, a reduction in the blacks, but nothing else. But if you look around the area of the glass that's standing up on the left, if I move my texture to the right, you can see quite a considerable change. I'll double click and reset it, and we can look perhaps at the broken glass that's lying to our right as I increase it and decrease it. But of course we're interested in looking at the effect on the background. The background here is quite light. Every image is going to be different, of course. I'm going to right click and we'll bring it up. Let's bring it up to 100%. I'll move it over into this position, go back to my texture, step it up, but what I want you to keep your eye on is the background around the edge of the glass. I'm sure the edge is going to sharpen up and look better, but we don't want to do that at the expense of other areas of our image, especially if we can clearly see the change, and here we can't. Let me reset it and we can see the difference. Back again. I think I'm going to use this slider quite a bit. Now, as you can see here, I've got a completely different image on screen. I've done a little bit of work on it, as you can see by the changes to the sliders in Camera Raw, but the texture slider has not been moved. We've still got the default setting. So one of the ideas I was thinking of is to use the texture slider in two different ways on the same image to maybe draw attention to areas like this area, which I want to be sharp and the center of interest. Now that's strategic editing, of course, and we can do that with the radial filter, the adjustment brush, and also the graduated filter. I tend to work in a slightly different way than many people I come into contact with. Let me show you what I do. Using the hyperlink at the center bottom of the screen, I set the little box here, or tick the little box, so that everything I open up as a smart object, which gives me access back to Camera Raw at any time. So I'm going to open this image into Photoshop, but before I do, I'm going to drop the texture completely off. And I'm going to open it. Once it's open, we'll see the thumbnail in the layers on the right hand side, and I need to make a copy of that. Now I need to copy my layer in the correct way here. The way to do that is to go just to the right of the thumbnail, right click, and choose New Smart Object via Copy. The top one we're going to leave soft, the bottom one we're going to adjust. So let me select it, double click, and it'll open up into Photoshop. I can now move my texture control from the extreme left to the extreme right, click OK, and this layer will be updated. What I need to do next then is to put a layer mask on that soft layer sitting at the top of the layered stack. I can do that from the bottom left of the layers palette. Once it's in place, I need to paint black onto the mask. That will make parts of this layer transparent or semi-transparent, allowing the sharp layer to show through. Let me whiz over to the left hand side because I need to select black as my foreground color. I need a soft edge brush. I'm just using the standard basic brush. For this demonstration, I'm going to push my flow and my opacity up to 100%. Generally I keep one or two of them down a bit low. Generally I stay with 100% there and adjust the flow here. But for the sake of this demonstration, I want you to see the effect. I think what I may do as well is just zoom in a little before we start. Let me pick up the zoom tool. I'll just move into that area there so you can see it more clearly. Pick up my brush once again, and as I start to paint, you can see how I'm bringing through the sharp areas through the soft areas beneath. And look how quick and easy it is to do using a brush. If I move over to the right where I've got all of that, is it called lichens or something? It's some form of growth, and I'm not good with flowers and plants, but look at the difference on that rusty hinge there. Well, I think you're getting the idea here. Let me hit Ctrl+0. Well, there we have the texture slider. I think it's going to have quite a number of uses. Great to enhance the texture that's already there, or subdue it if we need to, or maybe a bit of both. Now, as you can see here, I couldn't resist just one more image. This is a montage I put together a few months ago. I've opened this up through Photoshop and the Camera Raw filter. It's now not a RAW file but a JPEG. And I'm using the P key on the keyboard to set the texture to its maximum, and then touching the P key again, go back to the default setting. So there you can see as I touch the key again and again, before, there's the before and after. Makes quite a considerable difference on an image like this that does have a lot of texture within the image itself. We're just enhancing it. I think we need to keep in mind that image editing is a series of small steps, and this new tool is just going to be one of those. Generally speaking, every step we take is unlikely to be significant when we view it on its own. But when we combine a number of small steps together, then they can become a giant leap.